Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to An Ear for Men / A Voice for Men. I'm Paul Elam, coming to you now from the gym of the American Southeast, Roanoke, Virginia. And right now on this screen, you're looking at probably the 144 or so square inches of my home that is not a total disaster area. I had to clear that up and get something behind me that didn't make it look I was living out of cardboard boxes, which I am. But the move has gone well. I will be back on camera doing my regular video work as soon as I can clear out another 144 square inches to make a studio in this place. And I'll be getting back to my regular format for doing videos for An Ear for Men. But tonight I am here to talk about A Voice for Men, and more specifically about the third International Conference on Men's Issues coming up June 9th, 10th, and 11th in Gold Coast, Australia, the beautiful, fabulous Gold Coast. And I'm joined tonight by somebody you've never heard of, although he has been the editor-in-chief for A Voice for Men for a long time. He's just not near as flamboyant as Dean Esme or as into the limelight as people like John the Other were, and of course the supreme egotist myself. But Robert Brockway has been doing an outstanding job organizationally for A Voice for Men, also in preparing for this great conference coming up in Australia this coming June. And so with that, I want to give you an opportunity to say hello to the world, Robert.
Hi, Paul. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. First of all, I'd like the audience to get to know you a little bit. I don't want you to drone on about yourself the way I do, but maybe if you could tell people a little bit about what brought you to A Voice for Men and what made you decide to step up and start working on men's issues in this capacity.
Great. So I've been aware of a lot of the problems facing men and boys for really a long time. I remember talking about things even when I was a teenager, which was decades ago, talking about foreskins being used in facial creams and so forth. I remember knowing about that when I was 14. When I was 20, I knew about the non-gendered nature of domestic violence, for example. I was just aware of that from research that I'd done. And I knew the problems were out there, but I didn't see how bad they were until a few years ago, and I started to realize just how deep the problems were, and that's when I realized I needed to step up.
And in particular, in Australia, it seems like for about the past 10 years or so, that those problems have been getting exacerbated quite a bit. I know that Australia is home to Germaine Greer. It's home to people like Michael Flood, to Raywyn Connell, to what's her name, Clementine Ford, others and the White Ribbon Foundation that have been pushing a narrative right in the face of all the evidence that it's just flat not true, that domestic violence is a gendered problem, and now they're coming up with crazy laws and all kinds of things. Am I on target about that, or is it worsening in Australia?
Absolutely. I think over the last, as you say, around the last 10 years, it's definitely been worsening. We have government-funded commercials on TV here, which talk about men's violence against women and entirely ignore. First of all, they conflate the notion of violence and domestic violence, and then they entirely ignore other forms of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And that's government-funded. Government money, our tax money, is going towards that. We have one state here in Australia we call Victoria. And we're now joking it's the social justice warrior capital of the world. It's really completely out of hand, and it's getting into the education system. It's a very, very serious problem.
Yeah, from what I've been reading, especially the stuff about what they're starting to bring into young kids, grade schools now, the type of ideological education that they're starting to push in there about gender. It really is a nation that's starting to look like it wants to compete with Sweden or India in terms of the misandry that's a part of the culture and a part of the system there, which is, be honest with you, one of the main reasons we wanted to have a conference in Australia. And this is going to be quite an event. And one of the reasons I wanted Robert with me tonight to discuss this is that this is going to be, for lack of a better word, Australia-centric in its nature. There will be a lot of the familiar faces that you guys are familiar with from the internet, from YouTube, from A Voice for Men and other places. Karen Strom will be speaking. Janice Fiamingo will be speaking. Aaron Pitsey will be there from the UK. Mike Buchanan from the UK. There's going to be a lot of familiar faces there. But there's also a lot of people you may be less familiar with, but nonetheless are very, very well known in Australia and are actually some of the strongest voices I've heard opposing this new narrative that are quite brilliant. And I wanted to, use this talk to introduce some of those people to this audience and to remind the people in Australia just who's going to be at this conference in June on Gold Coast. And so I'm going to start tossing names out there, and Robert is here to fill us in, to let us know. And I guess I'll start with our keynote speaker, a woman who I am incredibly impressed with, Bettina Arndt, who is what I know about her is that she has been involved as a prominent figure in Australian mainstream media for a number of years. She's a clinical psychologist. She's a gifted writer and does a lot of articles, but can you sort of pick it up where I left off, Robert, and tell people who is Bettina Arndt and why is she going to be at our conference?
Okay, yeah. So as you say, Bettina Arndt, she's actually done quite a bit of stuff in the past. She's actually a sex therapist as well as being a psychologist, and as you say, journalist these days. She does a lot of radio. She's been on radio actually with Miranda Devine recently, and she's also had a number of TV appearances with other people we'll be talking about. She recognises the problems facing men and boys. She's absolutely out there and campaigning on behalf of men and boys to bring a focus on the issues.
Yeah, I saw her not too long ago. It was just maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago. I saw her do Mark Latham's TV show, and man, she was on fire. That was one of the best things I've ever watched. And she was naming names and kicking ass and telling the truth about what's going on with the narrative in Australia. I can't wait to see her talk. I think it's going to be a great discussion.
Yes, very excited about that. Actually, it'll be great.
And speaking of two other people we've already mentioned, the first is Miranda Devine, who I am less familiar with. I do remember her from an episode of Sunrise Australia where things got rather contentious. Of course, Mark Latham was there, so those sort of things happen in that way. But she's also been quite an open voice of reason in the discussion on gender politics in Australia, hasn't she?
Absolutely, and I'd say Miranda is even better known than Bettina actually in terms of nationally here in Australia. She's really standing up. She knows the issue. She's standing up and saying what's right. And I think, in fact, she gets a lot of pushback on that actually. So she writes a lot of articles for, like Bettina also writes a lot of articles for national newspapers, appears on radio and TV. And I would say probably Miranda really has been targeted by the social justice warriors and the feminists actually in many ways.
So they're really trying to turn up the heat on her. Do you think it's going to?
What's that? Sorry, what's it?
Do you think it's going to work? Are they going to side?
I don't think so. I think Miranda's just fine.
Yeah, she seems like a pretty tough-minded woman.
Absolutely.
And we're going to be very pleased to have her speaking there. Another person that comes to mind is Augusto Zimmerman, who is a professor out of Perth. I believe that's on your West Coast, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly, that's right.
And he's a legal scholar, and he will be talking about domestic violence laws and generally the lived experience of Australian men in your legal system. But other than that, I mean, I know that he's on board with what we're doing, but other than that, I don't know a lot about Augusto. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, but maybe you could fill us in on a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Augusto's actually written a number of articles in legal journals about the impact of radical feminism on the legal system, which I think is fascinating. He's actually with a law reform commissioner too here in Australia, in Western Australia actually. So his voice is being heard in terms of reforms of the law, and he's really bringing a spotlight onto those legal issues that we know so well.
Excellent. And then the next person that comes to mind here for me is Ken Aronson, who is another Australian that was actually recommended by Bettina Arndt to speak. Can you tell us a little bit about Ken?
Yeah, certainly. So Ken's a professor of law at Deakin University, and yeah, again, he's openly spoken about radical feminism and argued again about that in terms of the impact on our legal system. So, yeah, I think he's going to be a fabulous speaker, and I'm looking forward to seeing his talk, actually.
I tell you what, he's going to have to dumb it down for me. I read one of his papers, and he's definitely an academician. I'll tell you that. It was an exhausting read, but there was a lot of good stuff in it. And so we're also looking forward to that. And I guess finally, probably not finally, undoubtedly, there will be a lot of Australians at this conference, if not speaking at it, is Mark Latham, who for many people, even outside Australia, needs no introduction.
Exactly.
Mark is something. He's a very impressive man. And again, I was first introduced to him on an episode of Sunrise Australia, where he was, if you'll pardon the expression, he was mopping the floor with somebody for just generally lying and being dishonest. He seems like almost, and I don't mean to insult him, I have very little knowledge of Australian politics, so I don't know if he would take it as complimentary or as an insult, but he struck me as somewhat of a personality similar, at least in plain spokenness, to Donald Trump. And perhaps you'll know if that was a faux pas for me to let that come out of my mouth.
No, I think in terms of, as you say, his plain spokenness and so forth, I think absolutely. Mark Latham is, as most people probably know, he is certainly in Australia as a well-known figure. He formerly had the Labor leadership, so he's been a prominent member of the Australian Labor Party for a long time. That's our centre-left party here. If things had turned out only a little different, he probably would have been Prime Minister, I suspect. So I think he came quite close to that. Yeah, he's as you say, he's really a man you can't put down. I've seen him interviewed in the middle of a field by several people, and he's standing in the middle of the field. They're in a nice, comfortable studio, and they're talking about feminism, for example, and he owned the conversation, absolutely controlled it. So he knows his stuff, and he's really a guy you can't put down. Looking forward to seeing his talk.
We have a title of his talk. The title of his talk is going to be "The Myth of White Male Privilege." If that doesn't say something about the man's attitude, which, believe me, I am totally thankful for, that is a talk that needs to happen, because what we've seen, both in your country and mine, Robert, is this mythology of I guess, these lights that are on over my head, glaring in my face right now, I didn't pay for them. I just showed my white skin to the electric company. And they said, oh, well, no worry, you don't have to pay. There is this big myth that Caucasian males have some sort of inside track to better treatment. And maybe we can talk about that for a minute. I'd be interested in getting your perception, because, in all fairness, I've got to say, as somebody from the American South, that I understand what it's like to be able to drive through, some of the better neighborhoods, as long as I'm not driving some old jalopy, and not get pulled over automatically by the police. And so that is a real thing. There is, racial eyeballs. Of course, there are neighborhoods in Houston where I lived the past 35 years that if I drove in there as a white man, I might not come back out. So there is a counterbalance there. But do you lend any credence to the idea of male privilege?
No, exactly. Just like male privilege, I absolutely reject that idea. I think the situation is far, far more complicated than that. My view is just that men and women may each have advantages and each have disadvantages. So we know this, for example, from the high proportion of homeless who are men in most countries. And I think in Australia it's actually a little bit more equal than it is in the US. But in terms of the work that a lot of men end up doing, which ends up being quite dangerous work and so forth. So if there are advantages to being male, they're counterbalanced with many of the problems that men face.
Yeah, and I think that's what we end up talking about invariably when people talk about the privilege of men, and particularly the privilege of white men. They tend to point to the upper 1%, the movers and shakers in the world, as though that is representative of all men. And they ignore all the men sleeping under bridges, sleeping in ditches, working on crab boats, working in coal mines, dying at 35 from black lung. Which is still a problem for a lot more men than you would find running Fortune 500 companies or running governance in any capacity in the United States. And I think part of the problem is that we've simply allowed that kind of discussion to go unchallenged for 40 years or so, that people have been terrified to speak up because it's almost considered, an assault if you disagree with feminist ideas. And I'm wondering, is that the same situation in Australia? Has this just gone unchecked for so long that now when people do speak up, that, for instance, Mark Latham's talk will be a very controversial one?
Absolutely. We feminists had the floor to themselves for 40, 50 years. Absolutely. Nobody challenged their ideas. In fact, I like to say we're late to the party, but we're here now.
Yeah.
We're going to balance things up.
Or as I said, when I first launched my website, before I ever even took on other writers, when, I was literally getting dozens of people a week to read my writing, I had a little saying up on the website that said, what if there was a gender war and men showed up? And now, men and women, great women. Like I said, we've got Karen Strawn, Janice Fiamingo, Erin Pitsey. We've got the cream of the crop, all these great women, Miranda Devine, Bettina Arndt. There is a columnist, Corrine Barraclough, that's been covering a lot of men's issues lately. I understand she's going to be covering the conference there. She's writing a lot of good stuff, even out there defending Milo. And so I'm sure some rocks are going to be coming her way, but she seems undeterred. What do you attribute all these female voices? And you have it seems to be, in America, we have roughly nobody in terms of prominent female voices speaking to these issues. Canada has people like Janice Fiamingo and Karen Strawn, and Australia has people like Bettina Arndt, Miranda Devine, and others. The UK has Erin Pitsey, and American women just seem to be lagging. But what do you attribute, in Australia anyway, to the rise of these female voices that are coming forward as boldly as, if I said some of the things that these women would say, that they would be twisting that and writing articles about it in the mainstream media. What do you think has happened to elevate these voices into the mainstream?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think I'd actually suspect there's probably not one cause, because I personally know a lot of the women you're talking about here in Australia. In fact, Corrine Barraclough actually lives not far from me, and we've had a number of opportunities to catch up. So she's a lovely lady, by the way. And so basically, I've had an opportunity to talk to people in local men's rights groups in Australia, talk to women in local men's rights groups. I think there are possibly a number of reasons. One is I suspect that the women know that they can say things that the men can't. They can see the issues, and knowing that they have the power to say that, they're making the choice to stand up and say it, even at some cases in personal costs. And I know some of these women have paid a personal price for doing this.
Oh yeah, they're very quick to be called, gender traitors and internalized misogyny and all the other labels that they have created to identify why women must be self-hating or mentally deficient or something, or they certainly wouldn't be standing up for the issues, these glaring issues that nobody with any sense of ethics or nobody with a reasonable mind at all could look at these and say that's not a problem. But of course, there's a lot of people without ethics or without reason. Couple of other points I want to touch on. One, speaking of women, also India has their women. Deepika Bharadwaj, and I hope I have not butchered her name, but she is a documentary filmmaker that has made a movie called Martyrs of Marriage, and it's about the abuse of the I think it's 468A, 498A. I'm really showing my ignorance here. But it is a movie about marriage laws in India that has been filling theaters with 600, 700, 800 people. From the reports I'm getting, there's scarcely a dry eye in the house when this movie finishes playing. And she will be at the conference as well, showing this movie and doing a Q&A afterward. And I want to call everybody's attention to that. For any Australians of Indian descent in particular that may be interested in seeing this movie, it has been running all over India. This would be an opportunity for you to see it now. It's available at icmi.info. For a separate price, all conference goers, where the general conference tickets are still at $250. And that, let me divert for a moment. As the people that follow An Ear for Men know, because I've talked about it, I've just been through a rather protracted, difficult move from the mid-US all the way to the East Coast. It has set my entire schedule behind. Because of that, these talks, which Robert and I have started tonight, and we're going to be doing more of, really should have started over a month ago. And what we had planned to do was to do that in concert with the escalated pricing of the tickets. We had set a limit that the tickets were going to be at $250 until March the 1st, and then the price was raising to $300. Because there was a delay from my move, we're going to extend that to the end of March. So you can, between now and the end of March, get your ticket for $250, at which point on the 1st of April, they will go up to $300. Did I make that clear, Robert, or did I confuse people?
No, I think that makes perfect sense. So just to clarify, ticket prices are in US dollars.
Yes, they are in US dollars. So they would be $250 US, $300 after April the 1st. Also, speaking of movies and speaking of women, I shortcut the American women. We do have a rather well-known at this point American woman who will be at the conference, and that is the one and only Cassie J, the director of the Red Pill movie, which I'm sure some of you might have heard of. She is coming to the conference, and on the Friday evening, before the conference proper starts, there will be a screening of the Red Pill movie. Cassie J will appear there live for a Q&A afterward. Also, several members of the cast will be there, including myself, Janice Fiamingo, Karen Strawn, Robert, these names, and I'm getting old, guys. I turned 60. Mark Angelucci, excuse me, who was in the movie, will be there. As part of the Q&A, it is going to be quite an event. Kicking off with the Red Pill movie, we will have what's called a hungy. Tell us what a hungy is.
Okay. A hungy is a traditional Maori way of preparing food. So they from New Zealand, so they dig a big hole, and traditionally I believe the food is actually wrapped in banana leaves, but more recently obviously modern materials are used. The food is cooked under the ground for many, many hours, dug up, served, absolutely delicious. We have a fairly large New Zealand community here in Australia, and they brought the hungy over with them, and it's really caught on here in Australia, and absolutely delicious. Looking forward to it.
And to give away another little bit of my ignorance, when I first started writing up about the hungy, I said it was Australian, and the Australians did rush in to rescue me and say, Paul, you don't want to go live with that one in particular, because you will be hearing about it. So it is a New Zealand tradition from the Maoris there. Right. I've never been to a hungy, but we're going to have one, and it looks like it's going to be absolutely fantastic. That is a small separate price from your conference ticket, but it's available there when you check out at icmi.info. So to run that down, starting with the Friday, we will have the Red Pill movie with Cassie J for a Q&A, several members of the cast, followed by a hungy, a traditional New Zealand hungy with lots and lots of good food. That's a meat eater's thing, but we are working out vegetarian options for those, and those will be available on the menu before long. We're getting that accomplished. Then Saturday and Sunday, we will have 2 days of the most well-known speakers on men's issues anywhere in the world, including Australia. And the conference will conclude Sunday night. And of course, each night, Friday, Saturday, and I assume Sunday too, for many people that won't be leaving till Monday, will be followed by the traditional partying. The world, that's not a Maori thing. It's not an Australian thing. It is a world-class thing. We're going to party like we do at all these conferences, which, Robert, you were at the last conference in London with us. And what did you think of the partying after that?
Oh, it was fabulous. Look, it was. Look, we could have probably stayed up all night. Every day after seeing fantastic talks all day long, we'd head over to one of the bars and just have a nice relax and have a great time. And it was great to have an opportunity to meet the speakers and also meet the other conference attendees. We had a great time, and I'm sure we will again.
You know, at some point, there's going to be more footage of that. Steve Brule was there in London with us, and he filmed quite a bit of that. And I believe there was one point, my memory is slightly fuzzy, from one of those nights where he caught me after I had said yes to a few too many people who wanted to buy me a beer. And that might be some interesting footage. But we're going to be doing the same thing again come June in Australia. Want to remind everybody one more time, the schedule is as follows. You can get your tickets right now, $250 American. There's a link in the low bar to this, to icmi.info, where your tickets are available. You get your reservations now. You can get your Hungy tickets, or if you just want to attend the Martyrs of Marriage movie, you can do that. But if you go to the entire conference, of course, the Martyrs of Marriage movie is included with that. On April 1st, the ticket prices will go up to $300 American. Well, they will stay until about a week before the conference when we stop selling tickets. Robert, have I missed anything?
No, I think we've covered everything. I guess the only thing I'd probably add actually is icmi.info to go to the conference website.
What was that website again, Robert?
icmi.info.
icmi.info. They say the best thing in advertising is repetition, and I think we've met our quota on that. But folks, I know that it is a long, long trip for a lot of people who are not in Australia. And we are going to be doing other conferences. This is by no means the last one. But if you've been following current events, you know that Australia needs a conference, and it needs one that focuses a lot on Australian issues, which is why we set this one up with so many great Australian speakers. So you Australians that are listening to this, we don't know when we're going to be back. We don't know. I'm sure there will probably be other Australian conferences of this sort in the future, but we don't have a guarantee of when. This is going to be, for all you know, your one chance to get in on something like this. It's going to be, I think, a watershed moment in Australia. Robert, you've been, and I wanted to bring this up too, you've been doing some radio interviews, some talking to the media in Australia that finally started sniffing this out and wanting to talk about it. How has that gone for you?
Oh, really well, actually. In fact, I've had a number of media inquiries, and some of them have been from mainstream radio outlets like 2UE, for example, in Sydney. Others have been from, one was from 4ZZZ, which is a radio station that's long been associated with feminism, actually. So it was interesting to go on there and have a chat. Yeah, it's been great having an opportunity to get the message out. The feedback has been interesting. There's been a mixture of feedback. There's been a lot of people who've been very supportive after they've heard the radio interviews. There've been some people, despite the fact that we can support anything we say, and that we were even citing evidence on the radio. I was citing evidence on the radio. There were people who were claiming it just wasn't true, for example, in their responses. But that's after I'd even cited exactly the source that I was getting my data from. So yeah, but overall, I would say actually the response to the radio interviews was positive, and that actually brings up another point, a little bit something we were talking about a little bit earlier too. There's actually a lot of support in Australia for what we're saying. That a lot of people see the problems. A lot of people are too afraid to speak out, and very glad that a few of us are speaking out. So while we do have big problems here in Australia, there is an undercurrent where people are seeing the problems, but they need a bit of a focus. So having the conference here, having people talking about it, the inevitable media response that we'll get will really bring things into focus here for us here in Australia.
Well, I certainly appreciate all the good work you're doing there, and I really do take your experience with that as somewhat of a bit of progress. I know from the time that we announced the first conference in Detroit in 2014, I was flooded with media requests. All of them asked, have you quit beating your wife? And that was the end of the interview. And then they went on to write whatever they wanted to write, almost all of it lies. The fact that you have been getting some legitimate questioning, some journalists actually wanting to ask you about the issues and getting a supportive response from some of the reaction to the interviews says that we've really come a long way. And so you've been doing top-notch work, as you always have with ABFM, Robert. Just want you to know that's appreciated.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close this out?
I just wanted to mention icmi.info.
That's the website where they can buy their tickets for the conference?
I believe so. icmi.info, yeah.
I think I put that in the low bar, so they can just go down there and click right away and get it. For the followers of my channel, I want to thank you guys for your patience. I know I've just been putting out audio recordings for the longest time. Like I said, you're looking at the extent of the organization in my home right now, but it is starting to come together, and I will be putting out, building a studio and putting out back to the camera work as soon as possible. In the meantime, I will keep you guys posted on this event and others. Also a reminder for those of you in the States, especially on the East Coast that see this, there are only 25 tickets left for the March 7th Washington, D.C. screening of the Red Pill movie. I will be there for that, for the Q&A and for a lengthy discussion afterwards. There is going to be other people from the movie there, Tom Golden, Harry Crouch, who was just outstanding in the movie. Others, Robert O'Hara, who formerly with ABFM, been doing his own thing for a while. He's going to be joining us. If you can make it on March the 7th, there is a link that I will put. It's not in the low bar now, but I'll get it there. If I don't get to it right away, you can always go to my last video, and the link is in the low bar to that one. It's a tug event, which you have to sell minimum amount of tickets. We met the minimum. There's already been 106 tickets sold, and there's still 25 left before it sells out. So if you want to join us on the evening of March 7th in Washington, D.C. for another screening of the Red Pill movie and a bit of an after party and discussion, feel free to do that. Also, once again, icmi.info. If you can make the Gold Coast June 9th, 10th, and 11th of this year for what will be probably the most controversial conference in Australian history to date. And I personally can't wait for it. I can't wait to go down there and meet Robert again, who I met in London, but all these other great volunteers for ABFM and for other men's organizations, people from Men's Rights Australia, from Men's Rights Sydney, others will be attending. Looking forward to meeting all these people and some of these great journalists and speakers that have really been doing an inspiring job of showing us how to counter this toxic narrative about men and women that has dominated our culture for the past 40 to 50 years. And with that, I'm going to wish everyone a good night and say that we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul. Bye.